Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We are back with Dr. Judd Burton, and we're going to continue our conversation on witches and witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
So you brought up in the last episode that we did on this, something, a chapter in your book that was titled The Primal Witch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what's that?
Well, in many ways, it's really sort of the blueprint for the witch, and it's a combination of things that I've gleaned from anthropology, and they just so happen to line up with the kind of witchcraft that you see in the biblical narrative.
Is this a category or a label that you made up, or is this your understanding of an existing category?
I think it's sort of both. I mean, probably more the former than the latter.
Okay.
Because as I've gone down this rabbit hole over the last 10 years, even before that,
so you thought, why not build a template?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
There's a whole new, taxonomy and lexicon. That stuff is very important.
Mm-hmm.
In essence, as scholars and Christian scholars, we really have to create a kind of language for these subfields that we're generating.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's something like biblical giantology or what have you, those if we propose a field or subfield, then it needs to have a kind of taxonomy to it.
So give us the resume, okay? Whatever metaphor helps. So we've got, we've got a template approach. We've got this profile idea, recipe. I mean, it's probably a bad one, but
maybe all of those. Just throw it all in the pot.
Right. Yeah. So what is the profile? And when you use the word primal, you're sort of, when I hear that, I'm thinking the essential elements, not necessarily primal in terms of antiquity, although I'm sure it could go
applies,
there.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So what is it?
The primal witch, again, is an individual whose characteristics, practices line up nicely with the anthropological witch, because in many ways that's the primal witch. It's the first, it's the template for everything really that follows, and that begins in the antediluvian world with
so this is the prehistoric,
right, exactly,
right,
exactly.
which is why you're referencing the anthropological.
That's right.
So we don't have texts that tell you this.
Not working off text,
right.
You're almost entirely beholden to the archaeological record and what text you have, which are written later, long after the Hebrews had stopped being strictly an oral culture, arguably based on oral tradition that had existed amongst the Hebrews for
right. I mean this is really good, I think, for the audience to hear as well, because for those who are paying close attention here, it's not just this topic where you have to sort of navigate these waters, because people tend to think that, an ancient culture, they didn't believe something until they wrote it down. Well, no. I mean, writing was an invention that helped them preserve knowledge and transmit it and do lots of other practical things, okay? So people were thinking thoughts, they were believing things long before they ever, came across the innovation of, now we can make these like symbols, and it'll, people will know what we were talking about, So those are two quite different things, but they're obviously related, because once you get that innovation, then you can intentionally, preserve these things.
Sure.
But you can still, there are still things in the historical record in terms of anthropology and archaeology that will bear witness to certain practices or certain ideas. And so all of it is important. It's just, it's a chicken and an egg kind of thing, and you got to know which came before which and which one builds on what and all that. So by looking at anthropology, and then even before texts, but then when texts are known, they're consistent again with this picture that you're going to create for us. So again, give us the template ingredients. What if I was going to apply for the job? What do I need to be? What do I need to do?
Well, in the case of the earliest of these practitioners, the specific primal witch that we're talking about, you would have to either be, in the case of the antediluvian world, you would have to be a direct student or disciple of one of these watchers, or in later generations, one of the students of their progeny or the.
Right. So you have to, again. We'll broaden the term other than just watchers, but you had to be a person that was intentionally seeking contact
the sky
with whatever,
people,
right.
the spirit realm, yeah.
Right.
Right.
I mean, this has to be your thing.
Yeah.
So you have to be known for this. You have to have experience with it. You have to devote yourself to it. The solicitation element's important.
That's true, but there could certainly be an element of seduction.
Okay.
In
right,
the
you got to get
process.
started somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to have some motivation somewhere.
Right.
Yeah. So you need to be moving down this road, and then what skills do you have to have if that's part of the profile?
A pliable mind at this point, because
right.
a pliable mind and spirit. Because in the case of the watchers, you're looking at a complete corruption of in many cases, the moral trajectory of humanity.
Well, it's interesting, you have antediluvian, which for our audience is before the flood, and then after. And that's an important distinction because does writing exist or not? Okay. So it's interesting how in Mesopotamia with the Apkallu, I mean, what's said about them, and granted, this is from text now, but there was this time before we had text and before all this kind of stuff is going on. But it's really interesting that it's the scribal class after the flood that wants to link themselves and what they know with the earlier time. I mean, they intentionally do that, to sort of make the claim that we know what we know because the knowledge comes from, again, this supernatural source. And those who went before us, were like directly in contact here. So it's very, they're not shying away from it at all.
Well, and in earlier incarnations of those ethnicities, predecessors to those, whether they're the Kiangir or the Ubaids, even before that, they may have their progenitors may have occupied a similar position in society, but they were living in an oral culture.
Right. Yeah. They would have filled the scribe slot, but that would have been called something else because they're not writing.
And because we've had centuries of writing in our own civilization, again, not to get too far off topic, but the tendency is to think that people that live in an oral culture, who live day to day with mythology being a kind of web that all of their knowledge rested in, we tend to think of those people as somehow not as sophisticated as us. But they did things like engineering, which means that you watch the stars, you develop calculus without the benefit of writing. And we have examples, of redundancies built into cultures, such as in the Celts. Their druids memorized, copious amounts of material. Similar kinds of redundancies to ensure transition were in Hebrew culture as well. So just because they were, they didn't have a written language.
Just because it was pre-literate doesn't mean it was primitive.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I've seen and read things about how, the Egyptians were using the Pythagorean theorem before there was Pythagoras. That's just what it became called.
Sure.
But you don't need Pythagoras to derive that. Like I've seen people just explain this by taking a stick. Well, here's a stick. It's 2 by 3 by 4. It's just the different angles, and you multiply them, and that's all it is. This squared plus this squared equals this squared, and there you go. So I think that's important to point out that even if it's pre-literate, there's still a body of knowledge there that they're going to directly trace. Again, in their worldview, they're going to directly trace this to supernatural intelligences. for good or evil. Again, depending
Right.
on how the culture is going to define that.
Right. Which again lines up, to a certain degree with the biblical narrative, and particularly in the apocryphal material like Enoch. There's a kind of combination, a marriage, if you will, of practical sciences and occult knowledge that seems to be transmitted. There's no indication that writing was used in that process.
Well, let's take that. So primal witch.
Okay.
We'll switch gears a little bit and say pre-literate period witch. Okay. And so there's certain bodies of knowledge that they are going to trace back to either being taught these things by greater non-human intelligences. Again, trying to use really general terms here.
Sure.
You mentioned astronomy/astrology, and we both know in the ancient world there wasn't a whole lot of difference there.
And that's true of a lot of things. The intellectual compartmentalization that we're used to today is virtually non-existent in those sorts of cultures.
Well, I got it was an email communication a couple months ago, and someone who was in alternative medicine or herbalist. I'm not sure if I'm getting the label correct, the current label. Wanted to know if that was something wrong, because again, going back to these primal categories, people were using plants, okay, for potions and this or that, and
abortifacients,
right, all kinds of stuff. So they didn't have to have text to teach them how to do that. It was, experimentation.
Sure.
Okay. So they wanted to know, well, is this bad? Should, if I had a degree in pharmacy, should I repent or something? You can see where the odd sorts of questions would come out of that. And so there you have an instance where the culture defines, a legitimate versus illegitimate, sort of thing, but yet you have this body of knowledge that is not dependent on, civilization, in terms of being able to write and transmit, recipes and potions and all this sort of stuff. That existed before.
Sure.
So let's look at some of the categories. You've got, we have astronomy, astrology. We've got, again, what we'll call it pharmacopeia, okay, or some sort of herbal
whether
plant.
medicinal or
whether
for
medicinal,
harm.
right, or for anything else. What's another one? Can you think of another one?
I suppose this would be a subheading under astronomy, astrology, but the charting of the watching of the stars, the watching of celestial objects, weather patterns, and seasons was another one that would fall under it.
That one's actually interesting because my book on demons came out recently, and there's a section of, I think it's the first chapter, where I have to get into I drift into this whole category of are we allowed as moderns to sort of reject certain ideas that the biblical writers were talking about. And in this one, since it's linked to the natural world, it's a bit of a different question than should we reject something they said about the spiritual world. But it was how different entities were sort of put in charge of different either weather phenomena or events like earthquakes. Okay, earthquakes, lightning, storms, rain, all this sort of stuff. These would be assigned to deities. And it's interesting that it's one of those things. There aren't many of these things in the Bible, but these areas are actually one of these things where the Bible does demythologize in terms of the Canaanite deities. They don't get credit for any of this stuff. It's like it's all put under the sovereignty of God why these things happen, and they can't really articulate it like theologians would do really nicely today, about providence and whatnot. But they're definitely not assigning it, to what you just described, which was very common. That would have been a body of knowledge that out of the gate would have been attributed to, again, some sort of above human knowledge.
We have to remember too that part of the not just my Primal witch template here, but the anthropological, ethnological material, is also pretty clear about the manipulation of natural forces, the bending of nature to a malevolent will. Again, and I think that's very. I don't think you have to read too hard between the lines in the Enoch material to see that that's the case.
No, that stuff is certainly there, again, because of the Watcher traditions,
Mhm.
and which are, of course, are pre-literate. I mean,
Mhm.
that goes back long before, we have, written sources for that.
Mhm.
Do you think that, if we had someone from a pre-literate culture here, whether it's ancient Near East or what, do you think that they would know anything sort of about any of these natural processes, or are they all manipulatable at any given instant? Do you think they would fall in that category?
We can do that by analogy. That's what anthropologists have been doing for
Okay.
over a century. When they go and examine and live amongst these cultures that are pre-literate, that are pre-industrial.
Okay, that's a good. That would
so,
be a good analogy.
That if you want to look at mythology in a laboratory, a quote-unquote laboratory setting,
Mm-hmm.
that's an ideal place to do it, because those people still think to a great degree.
Right,
like
they're thinking along the same lines.
Along the same lines,
Yeah.
the people that were living during the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, the Chalcolithic, the people were still very much geared towards thinking, in a kind of mythological.
Now, do you think
process.
do you think that, like, somebody in Mesopotamia, and even the biblical period, or whatever period, that when they start to devote enough time, I mean, and it takes years,
Mhm.
like especially if you're doing like astronomy and astrology, you got to watch these things over the course of many years. But when they start to see patterns and they see regularity, they see order, do you think they would have thought that that was knowledge given to them from an external source, or they're still observing? I don't want to call them scientists by using a word like observing, the observational method, but do you think they still would have thought, am I learning this because of me or because of something else?
I'm going to give you an answer that's going to blow your mind.
All right.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
I don't think that they would make the distinction.
Okay.
Because again, we're looking at a different.
They're looking at themselves as conduits or tools.
Yeah, this is all part of what I used to tell my students is the mythological mind.
Okay.
These were the people that literally created civilization. They were the innovators that developed, agriculture and all the basic building blocks for. And they didn't they don't make those sharp distinctions in categories like later civilizations would do.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, we have to wrap up our episode, and we will, again, pick something else to drill down, because, again, all this does is just sort of open layers, and we can pick up on a few of those when we come back.
Excellent.
So thanks for being with us again.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and thank you for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our website, fringepop321.com, for more information about the things that we're talking about. And if you want to support what we're doing here, go to fp321.com/S, as in Sam, /S. And thanks again for watching, because what you know may not be so.